Well, ladies and gentlemen, this year is the 10th anniversary of 2008 global financial crisis. So my presentation first will have a review of this 10 years and the current status of the global economy. Then I'll discuss what are the roles of the NDBs to contribute to a more prosperous global economy. And the third, I also like to discuss how to achieve the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, adopted by the United Nations in 2015 and to be achieved by the time of 2030. Regarding the 2008 global financial crisis, when it first hit, it was as serious as what happened in 1929. At that time, you know, the burst of bubble in the New York Stock Exchanges and causing the whole world to have a great recession. And this time, we learned some experiences from the 1929s by coordinate effort of the G20 countries. First, to rescue the financial institutions. The second one, to adopt counter-cyclical interventions. And the third one was to safeguard free trade in the world. And by the three efforts, we avoided the worst possible scenarios as what happened in the 1930s. However, the global economy has not fully recovered yet. We know for the high-income country, like the US, where the global financial crisis started, they used to have an annual growth rate of 3% to 3.5%. That was an average for the high-income countries after the Second World War. But so far, even people was more optimistic about the US economy. But if we look into the real data, in 2017, the US growth rate was 2.2%. And according to the IMF forecast released by spring meetings in April this year, in 1918, the US is likely to realize 2.9% growth. That is still lower than 3 to 3.5. And next year, 2019, the US growth rate is likely to drop to 2.7%. And more importantly, in the past, when a country was hit by crisis, and when the country fully recovered, they should have 1 or 2 years of 4% or more growth rate. So far, we haven't seen that happen in the US. Certainly, people now say the unemployment rate in the US has dropped down to about 4%, something like before the crisis level. But at the same time, we know labor participation rate in the US is about 3% lower than the usual. So if you combine those together, US unemployment rate in reality should be around 7 to 8%. So US has not fully recovered yet. And the Eurozone, you know, their performance is worse than the US. In 2017, Eurozone's growth rate was 2.3%. According to the IMF, this year likely to be 2.4%, and next year, 2%. Japan, as you know, since its economy was hit by the burst bubble in 1991, Japan had lost decades, and last year its growth rate was only 1.7%. This year likely to drop down to 1.2%. And 2019 next year likely to be further drop down to 0.9%. When the global crisis was hit, I happened to be the chief economist of the World Bank at that time, and internally we had some debate in the bank and also across the street with the IMF economist. At that time, most people thought the crisis may last 3 quarters to 7 quarters. And the confidence came from the experiences, because since the Second World War, when a crisis started in the high-income country, in general, the crisis will be over by 3 quarters or 7 quarters at most. And at that time, I happened to be more pessimistic. And I said to my colleagues, did you read the Bible? And the Bible says when you have 7 bumper years, you're going to have 7 lean years. And so that implies this is likely to be much longer than 7 quarters. Now, it has already been 10 years. And we are not fully recovered yet. That's the first thing I'd like to mention. And under this kind of situation, what kind of role of the multi-development banks, multilateral development institutions can play? We need to understand how to help the high-income country fully recover from the crisis. Because high-income country, even their weight in the world dropped down to 40% now, but they are still the major economies in the world. And why not? After 10 years, the high-income country, including US, Eurozone, and Japan, have not fully recovered. Because we know when a country had some kind of crisis erupted, they must have some kind of structural problems. And if you want to have a fully recovery, it's essential to have some very deep-rooted structural reforms. But high-income countries so far avoid those kind of fundamental structural reforms and use loose monetary policy to float their economies. And how come that structural reforms is important? I think that has been recognized by almost everyone. However, how come high-income country has so reluctant to adopt structural reform? I think the reason is that in general structural reform, if you implement that, it will be good for the long-term economy. But during the time that you implement structural reform, it's contractionary. And when high-income country or country were hit by crisis, the economic growth rate is low, unemployment rate is high, and under the kind of situation politically, it's very hard to adopt structural reform, implement structural reform. Certainly, this kind of situation happened in the past. But in the past, in general, those kind of crises occur in developing countries, and then have some kind of crises, they will always come to IMF for rescue. When they come to IMF will impose 3 policies simultaneously. The first one, ask the European country in a crisis to carry out structural reform. And certainly IMF also understood those kind of structural reform was contractionary. Then IMF will also advise the country to sharply devalue its currency and to increase export and to use the export demand to create a job offset the contraction domestically. And the third one, if they follow this kind of policy advice, the IMF will provide some kind of rescue fund to weather through the transition. But this time, this policy package cannot work. The main reason is because this crisis happened in high-income countries simultaneously. Their products are in the same category of product. Their products are competing in the global markets. If a country wants to use devaluation as a way to increase export in order to generate space or structural reform domestically, other countries will adopt competitive devaluation to offset that. So it's in a deadlock. No country can use devaluation to create a space for structural reform, and as a result, no structural reform. And if there's no structural reform, something like Japan's lost decades, that means not only 10 years, 20 years, not Japan, 26 years. That scenario can happen. And if that scenario happens, certainly it will have a lot of other consequences. Something like Brexit, something like Trump phenomena can occur very often. Those kind of protectionism, populism can be something we have to expect in the future. Certainly Europe will be a challenge in the world. So when I predict the global crisis was likely to be a long term and we need to find a new way, at that time I proposed to use infrastructure investment as a way to create a space of structural reform. Because the main reason that you use devaluation was because you want to increase export. And infrastructure investment domestically can create demand, and especially infrastructure investment in the developing world can create the export demand of high-income countries. At that time, I made one studies to show that a developing country makes $1 investment will increase 70 cents of import. And among them, half of that will come from high-income country. And we know that developing country have huge need for infrastructure investment. According to the Asian Development Bank, that in the Asian each year, the requirement for infrastructure is $1.7 trillion US dollars from now to 2030. And I just participated in the African Development Bank annual meeting in Busan. And according to the new African Economic Outlook estimation, Africa each year requires 130 billion to 170 billion US dollars of infrastructure investment. If we can find a way to fulfill this kind of requirement, then it will create a large enough export market for the high-income country. And that will have the same function as a devaluation to create a space for the structural reform in a high-income country. Certainly, to make this fund happen, we need to have ideals, and we also need to have fund. The MDBs, Global Multilateral Development Institution, can provide some fund, and we also need to have bankable projects, and multilateral development institutions can help the developing country to prepare those kind of fundable projects. And if you have fundable projects, then you can use the MDB's fund to leverage the fund from pension, from surplus wealth fund, and by that we may be able to have enough funding resources to make those kind of investment in the developing world. And it will be a win-win. It will create a condition for the developing country to have a sustainable growth, and it will help the developed country to avoid the scenario of Japan of the lost decades. That's my second point. My third point, the SDGs. You know that was adopted by the United Nations in 2015. It's a political commitment of all countries in the world. And they are setting 17 goals and 169 targets. Certainly all of them are desirable. For example, no poverty, zero hunger, good health. That's all we want to have. But how to achieve that? I think the most important one is goal 8, jobs. If people can have jobs, they will have income, and they are not poor. And they will have enough fund to buy food, they will include their nutrition, they will not hunger. And certainly they will also take care of themselves. But how to create jobs, decent jobs, a job that can provide decent income to people? I think the key is goal 9, industrialization and infrastructure. Because we know that every country in the world, including those high-income countries in Western Europe, were North America. 3 centuries ago, 2 centuries ago, they were all poor. And when they were poor, there's one thing in common. They all rely on agriculture and natural resources for living. And if you want to become a high-income country, industrialization is the way to achieve the prosperities. Certainly, if you want to have industrialization, you also need to have infrastructure to provide power, to provide the road network so you can reach the domestic market and global market, and so you can have a better division of labor and so on. Those we know. But if we look, it shouldn't be so simple to industrialize. But the issue is that after the Second World War, among the 200 developing economies, only a few were able to be successful to have this path of industrialization to become prosperous. Statistics show so far only 2 low-income economies to move from low income to high income. Okay. And those are South Korea and Taiwan, China. Mainland China is likely to be the third one to become a country to move from low income to high income by the time of 2025. So that means most are unable to do that. And it's not they did not have the aspiration. It's not because they did not want to have that. I think it is because the ideas that they have did not work. For example, this year is the 40th anniversary of China's transition from a poor agrarian, inward-looking country to now the most dynamically growing country. And in China, the same people, the same land, the same government. What makes the difference? You can say transition. But transition is a common phenomenon. In the 1980s, 1990s in the world, all the socialist countries were on the path of transition. Latin American countries, African countries were also on the path of transition. But most of them are like China to have stability and sustained dynamic growth. Most of them, their economy collapsed, stagnant, hit by crisis. And what is the difference? What can we learn from those a few successful economies? And I find the few successful economies, they all have something in common. The first one, they are very pragmatic. Certainly, we all know the end goal we want to achieve. We want to be a high-income country, so we need to have advanced industries. But they all started from very humble, labor-intensive, traditional, sectors, industrialization in those kind of, look somewhat backward, traditional labor-intensive industries. We all know that one day we want to have good governance, good institution, good business environment. But they did not start with that. They started their industrialization, even they have very poor governance, very poor institution, very poor, business environment. including very poor infrastructure. So pragmatism. Start with what you can do instead of what you want to have, and you want to have as your policy guidance. I think that's wrong. Secondly, certainly, they all market economy, or they move into market economy, but they all have very proactive government to balance the challenges in the process of industrialization. And I think that NDB can play some roles. In the past, NDBs certainly have a goal to have a developing country, for example, in the World Bank. The model is a world free of poverty, free of hunger. But in the past, in spite of a lot of funds, a lot of effort has been provided to the developing country. But it did not work. Because in the past, the NDBs in general use the experiences in high-income countries, the theory generated in high-income country, to guide the policy making in the developing world. But we know the validity of theory and experiences very much depends on the preconditions. And the preconditions in the developing country are different. So intentions were always good, but the result were always disappointing. So this time, I think the job of the NDB should try to generate experiences and theories from the developing world, and use those kind of experiences and theory to help other developing countries. And because those kind of theory and experiences will be more relevant to address the issue in the developing world. So let me conclude. In the past 10 years, the world economy avoided the worst. And the contribution in the past 10 years, we know mostly came from the developing country. Because in the past 10 years, 80% of the growth were from the developing country. And although developing country, made a big stride, so their GDP in the world increased from 55% now up to 60%. But if they want to achieve the SDG goals, they still have a long way to go. And for that, infrastructure and industrialization will be essential. And infrastructure for the NDBs, they can provide funding, can provide experiences, and for the industrialization, I think NDB can provide some new experiences and new ideas generated from the developing world. And by that, we can achieve the goal of NDBs to help the developing country. We can achieve the SDGs, and maybe in some day, NDBs will be unnecessary in the world.